Welcome back to Moral Philosophy. In this lecture, I'll be discussing the pros and cons of utilitarianism. By this point, you should have read Mill's Utilitarianism, the chapter on utilitarianism in the Moral Philosophy textbook, and William's Critique. So you should be familiar with much of what I'll be saying. Let's start with a quick refresher on the theory. We've seen two versions of utilitarianism, Bentham's and Mill's. Bentham's slogan was the greatest good for the greatest number. He focused on pleasure and created the hedonic calculus for comparing pleasures and making trade-offs among them. Mill went on to refine Bentham's greatest happiness principle. His version of utilitarianism is known as qualitative hedonism. A key point is that Mill believes in a hierarchy of pleasures, and that the capacity for higher pleasures is a good in itself. Thus, Mill was able to argue that it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Now, it's very important to understand the difference between act and rule utilitarianism. What we've been discussing with Bentham and Mill has been act utilitarianism. This is the theory that says that the right action is the one that maximizes overall happiness. Rule utilitarianism is a version that says the right action is prescribed by the set of rules that, if followed, would maximize overall happiness. The idea of rule utilitarianism is one does not have to calculate what is right in each case. Rather, one is given a set of rules or principles that have been determined to provide the most happiness. So, for example, you would follow rules like don't harm people, keep your promises, take care of the poor, and so on. Now, the problem with rule utilitarianism is you might find yourself in a situation where following the rule that generally results in greatest happiness actually leads to less happiness in that specific situation. For example, suppose you desperately need medicine because someone is sick, but all the drugstores are closed. Breaking into the store to get medicine would lead to the greatest good, but it would be against a rule about not stealing. So neither one of these versions of utilitarianism is without problems. It can be very difficult under utilitarianism to figure out what the right action is, but rule utilitarianism can lead you to take actions that do not, in fact, maximize happiness. So in the discussion that follows, I'll be talking about act utilitarianism. One more point before I get to the pros and cons. It's important to know the difference between consequentialist and non-consequentialist moral theories. Consequentialist theories focus only on the results of our actions. Utilitarianism is clearly an example of a consequentialist theory. Non-consequentialist theories focus on elements other than or in addition to results. For example, the action in itself or the motive of the actor. A deontological theory is an example of a non-consequentialist theory that is based on a set of rules that prescribes what is right and wrong. We'll be looking at Kantianism in the next module, and this is the example of a deontological theory. People use these terms frequently when talking about moral theories, so it's important that you know what they mean. Now on to the strengths and weaknesses of utilitarianism. This slide summarizes the key positives of the theory. First, it has a compelling goal that's easy to understand. Acting with the idea of creating the greatest good just makes sense. Also, the theory focuses on the consequences of our actions. People sometimes complain that you can do the right thing but still do a lot of harm. Well, utilitarianism eliminates that possibility. It's also an objective process that treats everyone the same. This egalitarian aspect is very important for utilitarianism and, frankly, for moral theories in general. Also, utilitarianism generally follows our intuitions of what's right. Working to do the greatest good generally leads to actions that we feel are the best thing to do. And then finally, utilitarianism has a natural home in the domain of ethical policy. If you're making policies for a society, you definitely want to create the greatest goods in society, and the utilitarian theory is a good one for testing these kinds of rules. So there are a lot of reasons that people like utilitarianism, and on the surface, it's a very attractive theory. However, utilitarianism does have some problems, and I'm going to talk about these in more detail. This slide lists the problems that I'll be talking about. The first problem is that utilitarian principles can cause a person to violate her integrity. This is a key point in Williams' critique of utilitarianism. You'll remember that he considers two scenarios: Bill, who has a job that helps with biological warfare, and Jim, who is faced with a situation where he can save 19 prisoners by killing one of them. The utilitarian principle of greatest happiness greatly suggests that both Bill should continue with his job and that Jim should kill one of the prisoners, because each of these actions leads to the greatest happiness. However, if they do this, they will be violating some of their dearest held principles, and they will have strong feelings of guilt and remorse. Now, a utilitarian might say that these feelings are improper because their actions are the correct ones, so they shouldn't feel bad, but it's very hard to ignore these feelings and explain them away. Perhaps in a world where everyone was educated as a utilitarian, this would be less of a problem, but I still believe people would find it very difficult to kill someone in order to save other lives. There is also what Williams calls the problem of negative responsibility. If Jim does not kill a prisoner, he will be responsible in some way for the deaths of others. However, it is not Jim who kills the prisoner, it is the captain who does so. So is it really right to hold Jim responsible for something that he does not actually do? The second problem arises because utilitarianism focuses on the outcome and not the action. Now, this is good in some cases, but in others it's not, because the theory clearly says that the end justifies the means. But most people believe that there are certain actions that we should just not do, and it is easy to develop scenarios where the action prescribed by utilitarianism seems wrong according to our moral intuitions. Jim's act of killing one person to save the others is an example of such a problem. Another would be killing someone so that her organs could be donated to save the lives of multiple other people. This also would result in the greatest happiness, but is certainly not something that people believe is right. Examples like these create a problem for reflective equilibrium, which, as you should remember, is the idea that the principles of a good moral theory should lead to actions that are supported by our intuitions about morality. The next problem is that it is difficult to determine the right action in complex cases. We've already talked about this several times, so I just want to note it again. One must also consider the probability of different outcomes in many situations, and this makes the analysis even more complex. The next concern is what's known as the problem of aggregation. This problem occurs because small benefits to many can outweigh great harm to one or a few. The philosopher Thomas Scanlon uses the example of Jones, who is working in the control room of a TV studio that is broadcasting the World Cup to billions of people. Suppose there is a problem and Jones becomes trapped under some equipment and is receiving serious shocks. The only way to save him is to turn off the game for 20 minutes. That causes billions of people to lose the happiness they have from watching the World Cup. The utilitarian calculus will probably say that the sum of all these small harms to billions of people adds up to greater harm than the benefit of Jones. But most of us would agree that it would be right to turn off the TV and to save Jones from the shock. Similarly, there are cases where greater benefits to many can outweigh a significant harm to one or a few. For example, there are situations where drug trials were done on unknowing people and they suffered significant harm. Now, these trials did lead to important medical breakthroughs that caused benefit to many people, but in this kind of case, even though the benefits are not trivial like the World Cup, most people would still agree that that is the wrong thing to do. Thus, in summary, there are problems for utilitarianism with the aggregation of benefits. And finally, there is the demandingness objection. Utilitarianism says that the right action is the one that creates the greatest good. Therefore, the highest and best possible action is the minimum standard of morality. This means that there is no possibility for what is known as supererogation, going beyond the minimum. For example, helping the poor is morally good, but we do not specify exactly how much help you need to give, and we recognize that some people are more generous than others. Viewed strictly, utilitarianism says that you should give to the poor until both of you are in a similar situation. This is because the dollar that you give can create more happiness for someone who is worse off. But many would argue that this is an unreasonable demand and that it is a problem with the theory. We will be looking at this kind of argument in more detail later in the course. So as we've seen, utilitarianism has both strengths and weaknesses. You should know that we've been looking at a simple version of utilitarianism, and proponents have come up with ways to get around some of these problems. But nonetheless, there's no question that utilitarianism has weaknesses. So here's my summary. I believe the idea of promoting the greatest good is very attractive. Also, that the theory works extremely well for social policy and many business situations. But you need to be careful about harm to individuals or minority groups. However, I do think there are significant problems for utilitarianism as a general moral theory. The key ones I see are the aggregation problem, the problem of ends justifying the means, and the difficulty of calculating utility in complex situations. But it's important to recognize there are philosophers who would disagree with this assessment. Also, as we'll see, all theories have some problems, so you're not going to find the perfect theory. As I said at the beginning of the course, Your goal should be to understand these theories and use them to determine what makes sense for you. So that's it for now, and I'll see you next week when we start our study of Kantianism.